Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 7th AATF Technology Thursday webinar. Today's presentation will be hosted by IDX. Our webinar this morning is Digital Convergence, the blurring of boundaries between manufacturing, mining, retail, banking, and residential for cost reduction and efficiencies of scale. Industry 4.0, Internet of Things, Big Data, artificial intelligence, real-time data analytics, and others convey a world of rapid digital convergence that magically removes the complexity of data integration and compliance, and accelerates innovation and new ways of doing business. This webinar starts and concludes with the IDX theme from AATF 2019, Establish, Maintain, and Leverage Data Connectivity for Business Benefit. While briefly investigating digital convergence, the blurring of boundaries between manufacturing, mining, retail, banking, and residential for cost reduction and efficiencies of scale. Our presenter today is Dave Bean. David Bean, Managing Director of Industrial Data Exchange, who has been active in the field of real-time digital communications across many industries since 1978, will share some practical insight into both the promise and challenges of digital convergence. While the session is ongoing, please feel free to use the question and answer facility at the bottom of your screen throughout the presentation, and they will be answered afterwards. Without further delay, we can now begin the presentation as I hand you over to Dave. Thank you.
Right, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can, Dave.
Okay, just gonna share my screen. Okay, we all good to go? Get myself sorted out here. Right, I guess the first thing is welcome to everyone who's taken the time to register and participate in today's webinar. I think really from the outset, I'd just like to say this talk is not a product or services pitch, but yeah, rather a sharing of some thoughts on this landscape of digital convergence and how it relates to us in the industries that we operate in. And I guess we all really barely scratch the surface, but hopefully, you know, what is shared in our discussions in the Q&A will trigger and motivate you to do your own investigation into topics that are relevant to you and yeah, get a deeper understanding for yourselves. So the basic agenda, as I've put it there, is first to set the scene, then to have a look at those things that enable convergence, then kind of just come back to solid ground and recognize the fact that the road is full of potholes, but at least if you are aware of them, you can kind of navigate around them and not come to too much harm. Then we wrap up. I'll hand back to Letitia and we'll have our Q&A time. So, if we go back to Africa Automation Technology Fair last year, 2019, when we were preparing for it, we tried to think of a theme. We knew overall there was this whole thing of Industry 4 and the Internet of Things. And we know even our government, you know, every speech had this concept that we would train our children for Industry 4, and it was like this magic pill. You swallow the pill and utopia arrives, all your problems go away. So we thought, well, let's have a look at, I don't know, the practical context of things like IoT and Industry 4. And we distilled it down to, in our kind of core competence area, a message of establish, maintain, and leverage data connectivity for business benefit. And I think this thing of business benefit is really important, because technologies themselves are not an end in themselves. They are enablers, tools to let you achieve whatever the objective is. So in terms of business, there are probably a whole lot of kind of measurements or outputs that companies are looking at, like efficiency, safety, environmental responsibility, the sort of ethical way of doing business, not offering bribes or accepting bribes. The concept of sustainability, not only for the business, but the whole kind of ecosystem in which one operates. Because things change so rapidly, the sort of concept of flexibility and agility to adapt. I think for a lot of businesses, this recent COVID-19 and the lockdown certainly threw a bit of a curveball at the industry. I know we as a company, we've had a whole lot of these tools for doing video conferences and everything. But unless you are shaken out of your comfort zone, you kind of often just stay with what you're comfortable with. So I think there are a lot of businesses who are now using things like Zoom and Teams meetings much more regularly. And hey, it takes the schlep out of a lot of travel and sort of time wastage. So for us, the kind of key output was business benefit, and our kind of three enablers were get your wired or wireless and multiple protocol pathways working for you. Once you've got these established, keep them open and the data flowing, and then hopefully, because you had some business benefit in mind, you're able to leverage that data and make sensible decisions. So just in kind of summing up this first slide, I think for us, the most important thing was to have a clear business objective in mind. And then I think be prepared to take small measurable steps. And I mean, we're not alone. I think many others argue too that Industry 4.0 and IoT, you know, it's a journey of discovery rather than an instant cure. And yeah, that's the kind of reality. Okay, so again, staying with our theme in the Automation Fair 2019, and specifically looking at process automation, we simplified our focus for business benefit to two key domains of focus: sweating physical assets and empowering people. And I suppose not the other way around, you know, sweating your people and empowering physical assets. So yeah, I suppose there's also the hope that organizations that you're assisting in these areas also do it in a way that supports ethical sustainability and a positive impact on environment and society. So in both of those domains, you find technology advances and digital convergence open a whole lot of new opportunities and make existing requirements a whole lot easier. So now we look, I kind of guess in the topic, it was suggesting that we've got all these different industries, banking, finance, manufacturing, food and beverage, power, water, you know, and so the list goes on. The suggestion is digital convergence blurs the boundaries. So I think the first thing that I'd like to look at is this concept of standards and compliance. So historically, you can imagine each industry came out with standards and the sort of rules for compliance that were focused on their domain of existence, what was important to them. And in parallel with that, as things got more and more connected, you found communication protocols coming into existence that again were focused on whatever the requirements were for that industry. So we have a plethora of literally hundreds of different protocols that exist. We have acronyms, guidelines, rules, regulations that are very industry focused. And in a sense, to cause confusion, often the same acronym in two different industries means something completely different. And I'll share one experience that we had. We were using Google AdWords. So a while back, we were doing OPC training. So OPC for us was a keyword in our digital marketing. We weren't aware that Opel were going to go and introduce a model car whose title was OPC. So I think we had a whole lot of confused guys on the internet. When they clicked, they didn't find a car on our website. So you had, very much these different islands of standards, compliance, technology and innovation, skills and experience that really made sense in those industries. Obviously, if you take something like, I don't know, simple like a piece of paper or a pen, nuts and bolts, drills, you can see how those could be used in lots and lots of industries. And things like quality, health and safety, there are a number of things that lend themselves to being common enablers, and in terms of standards and compliance, things that you could apply across the board. But I think the lack of convergence early on, if you go back 50 years or whatever, is we did create islands where there was a lot of duplicated effort. And I think in recent times, there's been a lot of effort to try and get everybody onto the same page so that we can share learnings and kind of initiatives. So maybe this slide is, I suppose, maybe a little bit more philosophy than technology, but digital convergence is given us this sort of idea with Industry 4.0 and the sort of Internet of Things of a full cyber physical integration taking place, where there is almost sort of transparency and that ability, customers, manufacturers, regulators can kind of tap into information and share it. And it becomes almost an instantaneous expectation. With all this access to information, we have this kind of thing of ethics and integrity, because you've now got on tap a whole lot of information that you can manipulate for harm, greed, or power, or harness for common good. And if anybody's been following the sort of lead up to the American elections and this most recent presidential run of Donald Trump, you will see how social media and news media and that can very much steer a conversation or an analysis of the status quo in any direction. It doesn't necessarily have to, in a sense, align with truth or facts. You can just create fake news very quickly and spread it incredibly quickly. So there is this element of information being instantaneous, and I think with that, there's vulnerability and transparency, which can be either a good or a bad thing. So if we switch across to our context of establish, maintain, and leverage, you kind of think establishing, you make use of the cloud and in a sense, the work and infrastructure of others, and possibly you add some of your own to it. When it comes to maintenance, you'll find in most businesses, there's certain things they look after in-house, others it's sort of outsourced. There is a dependence, whether it's on a Vodacom or an MTN or Telcom, some of the big providers of IT kind of infrastructure management, there are companies that do that. But then in the space of leverage, I just thought if we carry on with that thing of sort of good or bad, we find you can do intentional harm or unintentional harm. So sometimes if we haven't thought things through properly, maybe we're vulnerable to hacking, or we're able to open a valve when we shouldn't be able to open it. Hopefully most of the time we do the intentional good that was our business benefit purpose. And again, often you can't see the wood for the trees. And I think as you learn and establish and you're leveraging something, somebody else looks at what you've done and they sort of think, well, if we can do that, we can do something else in addition. So you end up with, I think, often unintentional benefits that get added. So now we move away from setting the scene to convergence enablers. And just having a look at how we're doing time-wise. So we've been going for, what, about 15 minutes. So maybe just kind of very quickly, you had this sort of before world and an after world. The before world, in a sense, you had real people with pens and paper reading books. Books were stored in physical libraries. You had things like the typewriter. You wrote a letter to your aunt and you posted it at the post office, and there was an expectation that, you know, within a few days or whatever, the aunt would get it and be able to read it. You could make a telephone call, but the telephone was fixed in one place. You had to always go to the telephone and dial a number. I think built into our psyche was an acceptance, even if sometimes it was a bit frustrated, that things took time, there were delays, and structurally, things were sort of fixed and a little inflexible. Because we often manually copied things, you wouldn't intentionally make a mistake, but it was very easy for errors to crop in. With the advent of computers and the internet, we've seen a kind of shift across to our communications being much more dominated by emails and WhatsApp, you know, social media type interactions. Zoom meetings like today, in the background supporting stuff. We have spreadsheets and databases and fancy applications to look after payroll and you know, banking apps on our phone. The ability to communicate, you don't go to one place where there's a phone attached to the wall. It's in your pocket. So the thing of smartphones, tablets, kind of access to the internet means almost your office or your ability to communicate, whether it's for work or for leisure, is wherever you are. So we've become a much more instant, mobile and flexible society. And with all of that digitization, you have the ability to be, in a sense, much more consistent, repeatable, and scalable in the things that you're doing. Now, in addition to real people, you can have bots and artificial intelligence. I don't know if anybody gets frustrated like me. You go and look at a site and this thing pops up and says, how can I help you? But behind the scenes, it's kind of got some keywords, and so you say, I would like to do X, Y, Z, and it'll come back often to you with, yeah, can't comprehend, or some really useless response to that question. Or it'll try and force you into kind of some pattern that it can take you on a journey that often you're not interested in going in. Also on the slide, I just put it up for interest, is I think the internet was a big factor. So although the research started by the American military back in the 1960s, on the 6th of August, which is pretty much this month, whatever that is, 29 years ago. Is that 29? Yeah, not that long ago. The World Wide Web came into being. Below that, I'll just show you a little bit of a time continuum. We had IBM with its mechanical typewriter and then electronic typewriter back in the 1911. Now, they've always been very innovative. So things like Node-RED, if anybody's played with it, that was something that IBM contributed to the sort of open domain. They have, Watson, this kind of clever guy who can play chess and answer all the difficult questions. Intel, who are responsible for the chips that went into the early Windows and MS-DOS machines. Unix as an operating system, 1971. Surprisingly, I didn't realize SAP started so soon, but I suppose you can almost expect that from the Germans. But 1972, SAP, the sort of whole enterprise resource management idea. Microsoft, where IBM said, you know, they'll only be used for whatever it was, 3 computers in the world. And maybe they got that a little bit wrong. Apple, Steve Jobs, and fantastic kind of innovation and the way of looking at things. Oracle, I think a key thing was satellites and GPS in 1978. Boy, think about driving around these days, how wonderful it is to be able to just stick something into your phone, and most of the time it'll help you get there. Although in countries like South Africa, sometimes you will find a blocked off road or routes that are less desirable in terms of getting to your destination. 1991, as well as the World Wide Web, was the introduction of Linux. Amazon, an online kind of business, 1994. 1998, we had Google and the sort of rapid advances in search engines. Before that, you did have Yahoo and a couple of others, but Google, I think, really kind of set the standard. And then, yeah, over the years, I've got a little icon there, just a growing and changing plethora of social media. For the hobbyists, Raspberry Pis, Java, .NET, there's a democratization now of software and hardware. So you want to build your own little whatever, you can go and do it. People start to write apps and that, not requiring, in a sense, very much in terms of paid resources. The last two things, first looks like a kind of ship. It's not the Titanic, but Kubernetes and Docker are things that allow you to do containerization of software in the cloud. So this whole thing of being able to scale infinitely and quickly are enabled by those sort of technologies. So that first set, I guess, is largely enablers that we took for granted. They just kind of snuck up on us and they're there, taken for granted. In terms of process automation, this slide, I just bring to your attention the fact that there are a whole lot of organizations who are collaborating to kind of drive us in the direction of Industry 4.0, where the idea is you have models and a way of describing things so that literally you can track an idea from a concept to it becoming a realizable product, right through to, in a sense, when it eventually is disbanded. So like for plants, raw materials, all that thing is information that takes you from the starting point, a full life cycle, to when it comes to an end, or you know, if you're recycling it, you know, it comes back to life in another form. So with that, there's something called RAMI, Reference Architectural Model for Industry 4.0. So the guys are working, it really is still a work in progress, but if you can just think of a framework that describes absolutely everything in every domain. I think of importance for us is something called APL. It's Advanced Physical Layer. So it's the extending of your IP stack right down to the instrument level. So in time, we would remove that thing to go through gateways to some other protocol. The protocols down at the instruments would support living on an IP stack, kind of integrating into the cloud. Obviously 3G, 4G, 5G make connectivity easy. TSN stands for time sensitive networking, and it addresses the challenge of everybody, in a sense, having a common time standard. GPS, I've mentioned before, really great for location and tracking, and also having a kind of a common sense of time. Namur is one of these organizations that tries to document standards and everything in different industries. And in the process automation industry, there's an initiative called PADIM, which stands for Process Automation Device Information Model. And again, it's a way of describing devices so that through the full life cycle of like planning a project, designing it, to actually when you're running and maintaining a plant with those instruments, you can access the data for configuration, for diagnostics, for the kind of runtime control side easily. And I didn't mention it, but there is an IEC standard, the Common Data Dictionary, which all of these things leverage. So the idea is somewhere you want to have something which says these are the semantics that we use, and this is what they mean in the various contexts. I'm going to go very quickly through the next two slides. I think all I want to kind of leave with you is a sense that I think in terms of enablers for convergence, this ability to share and model information is probably the most key element. So it will let you describe some entity, it could be a boiler, some piece of equipment, in a way that you can simulate it. The clever guys now, they can have the actual plant running and then they will make a replica of it, and they'll do what they call digital twinning. So maybe if you lose an instrument from this digital twin, it can almost act like a smart sensor and suggest what a missing measurement should be. And it also lets the guys do some sort of what if scenario planning. So you can build a virtual plant, look at cost of raw materials and everything, and decide whether it's worth actually building a physical plant. Also, technologies like OPC UA, they have a concept of, they built into it is this information model, but they have an idea of companion specifications. So every vertical, industries and subcategories like, I don't know, doing stuff with rubber, conveyor belts, whatever it is, there will be a companion standard that describes the semantics and everything for the models that exist in those space. So the idea is, if everybody, in a sense, describes their models in a consistent manner, it's going to be a heck of a lot easier for us all to collaborate and work together. So I'm sure the stuff will be shared, but I'm not going to really go through this kind of very busy slide. Just in a sense, take it from me, I think models are a key enabler. So now we get to the potholes, and I think the first one is always maybe the one that not enough care is taken. And I put in brackets there politics, because I think running a successful project, often it's not the technology that prevents it being successful. It's much more the managing of people and expectations. So this is probably a webinar on its own. So I'm just going to leave with you kind of manage expectations, have a clear understanding of what the business case is, how you're going to get there, and who you need, and then just make sure everybody's accountable on the same page. You've got buy-in from everyone, and don't let too many other additional outputs get thrown into that initial step or two. Just focus on kind of doing one thing well relatively quickly, and then you can sort of review your learnings and the outcome and move on from there. Second pothole, synchronization and health monitoring. At IDX, we often break digital connectivity into 3 challenges: configuration management, health monitoring, and data routing. And the reality is data routing might be seen as a desired outcome, and the first 2 as enablers. So in synchronization, just kind of at a fairly high level, this is this thing of how do you link data points in different systems. So if a configuration changes or something isn't available, how do you flag that? Because often reports and dashboards, in a sense, are trusting that what they connected to is, in a sense, alive and truthful. So you can imagine if you swapped, I don't know, if part of the plant changed, but nobody informed the people doing reports, there might be numbers and things that are going into the reports that aren't really connected to instrumentation that's on the plant. Something that we often bump into is a frustration often in organizations where they discover they don't own their own data, and they end up having to pay outside parties lots of money to get reports or whatever on their own raw data, so they'll get some fudged data. And I don't know, I just get the sense people often aren't sure whether the data that they're looking at is truthful. So yeah, I think it's something just to be aware of, who owns the data. And then, just understanding what all the connection points are, the different interfaces, how often they update. So maybe in terms of that synchronization, it's almost this thing of you've got consumers and producers of information, and it's like you have a contract between them, and built into that thing, you want to have the ability to make each other aware if something changes. So if there's a need for more information, or if the source changes, you just keep kind of updating. Health monitoring, it's just that sense, how sure are you that the data that you're looking at is correct, it's still flowing, it hasn't been fiddled with. I'm going to move on because I can see time is marching on. The next, and this is the second last pothole, is this concept of time. It seems so simple, you know, the time is now 10:42. Well, that's true here in South Africa, but it's quite different if you're in Boston or somewhere else. Then you chuck in the added difficulty of daylight savings. So you can imagine if you've got a trend and you're trending in a local time where daylight savings is about to either change from time going backwards or time going forwards. It's an interesting trend to have a look at, because when you put the time back at, you know, let's say it happened at 10 o'clock in the morning, suddenly you're going to have another data point at 9 o'clock. When you go the other way and time goes forward, you've kind of got this gap of an hour. So this UTC's idea is have enough information in the timestamp, and if it's UTC, there is only one kind of point for each time. Where you're at some other location, then reference it relative to that. So you can say the time is this plus so many kind of hours and minutes. So yeah, just be careful of time formats, daylight saving, the locales, particularly if you've got things like CSV files in that, they'll have a time stamp in there, and yeah, it's useful to know where it was generated. Time accuracy and jitter, it's particularly as we have all this convergence and everything's connected, if your clock sources aren't synchronized and they're sort of wandering, it's very difficult to do root cause analysis because you're not working to the same absolute time reference. So yeah, just have a policy on how you handle time differences in those scenarios. Late data, yeah, is it still useful? How do you handle it? I say here, an accurate wedding invitation that arrives the day after the event. It might be pretty, and it had all the correct details of the venue, the time the wedding was starting. But if it arrives the day after, it's not very useful. When you have a disruption in a communication channel, either because, I don't know, you've had load shedding and kind of you've lost connectivity. Is the information buffered? And then when it arrives, what do you do with it? Do you have that ability to backfill? And often that's important for record keeping. If you're also doing control, maybe there is a point where, and I'll talk about it more in the next thing, you've got to make a decision whether, in a sense, it's too late to actually use in terms of control and you have some other thing to do. Often, if you take in mining, you'll have something like metal accounting. So people will say, you know, these were the figures of how much gold was produced or whatever. Much later on, somebody's kind of done the thing more accurately and they adjust the figures. So you have this concept of if you're doing any aggregation, the ability is to go and recalculate with data where history's been altered, and your reports, in a sense, will have a new and different result. Latency, yeah, as I was saying, did you get it in time to make a properly informed decision? So it's that concept of the time between the change actually occurring and the change being reported, and then now you've made a decision to do something. How long does it take before that decision goes out and the actuator kind of moves? Latency, again, if you look at this whole thing of the cloud, I think we still have with us for a long time to come justification for on-site intelligence, where even if the internet or whatever is down or slow, you can safely and reliably kind of do local decisions. Fault mitigation times, really, because of the fact that things do go wrong, is just, I don't know, having a common understanding of time. When do you need to react if something hasn't happened, and then what will you do? In terms of synchronization, a technology that it will sort of evolve over the next couple of years. Time-sensitive networking, I think, will go a long way to alleviating this unsynchronized clock problem. And also the fact that APL will take the IP stack down to instruments that will let you have, in a sense, the same version of time, hopefully, down to every instrument. Last thing, data, is it usable? I've covered some of this stuff, but it seems like a simple concept. You want to measure something, so you connect a sensor, you read the value, you store it somewhere. But the usability of that data has so many underlying factors. In OPC, we provided with what appears to be a neat encapsulation of measurement data. You have a tag and lots of associated attributes like instrument, number, description, range, engineering units. But in terms of actionable data, we have this concept of a value, a timestamp, and a quality. So I'll show an example there of sump oil level, process variable. It's 43.4%, and the time was whatever, and its status is good. If the instrument was faulty, then you'd have a quality of bad, and there would be some sub indication in the quality to say, broken sensor or what have you. Then you have the sort of aggregated complex record, like a batch record, where you might have a whole lot of numbers that all share the same timestamp. They only make sense together. Live data, I think it's just being aware, what update rate do you have? How do you know that it's healthy and accurate? Late data, we've spoken about. How do you deal with it? Buffering is really useful. And then if you can buffer and backfill, how do you have some indication that, in a sense, an update has been done? So if you've got algorithms that need to rerun a report, that you can trigger them. Historical data, so you've got this value. If it's a set point, you might want to have the concept that when you store it, and you're only storing changes, you have a concept of it being stepped data. So its data, if you were to draw a trend, would stay fixed until somebody made a change. Unstepped data would be like a process measurement. So compression and that will do its best to not store any more changes than it needs to kind of maintain the trend. But the line, it will interpolate in that. So you'll get like a nice smooth curve. With set points, you really don't want your trending tool to go and interpolate the set point, because that's not what actually happened. The set point tends to be much more like a digital on-off. You know, you were at this setting and then you jump immediately to some other setting. Concept of configuration management, I touched on that briefly, just knowing what's changed and how to deal with it. Data security, yeah, you don't want people changing the data, who has access, who can set something, who can read something. So data security and data access you need to deal with. And at the moment we have a mixture of kind of legacy systems and more modern systems. And I think a number of these things, particularly the sort of access and security, is still quite a bit of a challenge. So in wrapping up, yeah, we're undoubtedly in an accelerating phase of digital convergence in Industry 4. They're key enablers in blurring the boundary lines between all sectors of business and personal life. Standards supported by compliance, innovation-driven technology and the associated skills and experience will move us towards seamless and full physical cyber integration. But the journey is long, the road full of potholes, but I think there are memorable stops and places worth visiting along the way. So enjoy the low-hanging fruit. Don't let hype and jargon overwhelm you. And let's all be part of the journey, the adventure of the journey, and share some of our recent journeys and future plans at Africa Automation Fair 2021 and elsewhere. And with that, I would just say thank you to Reed Exhibitions for enabling this webinar, for all the work that goes on behind the scenes. And thank you for everybody who's tuned in to listen. Yeah, I hope you've got some questions. So with that, I hand back to Letitia.
Thank you, Dave. That was a very informative presentation. And technology-wise, we have certainly come a very, very long way over the years. We do have some questions from the audience. While I encourage everyone to submit more questions so that Dave can answer them live for us, right now on the screen there's also a poll. If you wouldn't mind just completing that for us, this helps us improve the content going forward, so that we continue to bring you relevant content during these presentations. So Dave, the first question from the audience is, how ready is South Africa for digital convergence? What are our greatest challenges?
Yeah, I think it's a very valid question, and I would say, unfortunately, it's a lot more talk. I think industries like automotive, and that a lot of the things that go into where Industry 4 is going are already in place, because we tend to be very much driven out of Japan, Germany, and places. But yeah, I think the sort of education and yeah, and I don't know, just general information sharing is a big hurdle for us to overcome. You know, it's too easy to just say Industry 4.0 is going to solve everything. It is a complex and long journey.
That is for sure. We have another question from the audience. They want to know, with COVID-19 and so many people working from home, what do you think business will look like after COVID-19 when the restrictions are completely lifted?
I think business is going to be quite different in the sense of the balance of people working from home and in the physical workplace. I think for a lot of companies, they will have discovered efficiencies of spending less time in the office. I think also meetings with suppliers, customers, or whatever, where one used to hop in a car and drive to Polokwane or wherever, a 1 hour meeting with various parties, but you've spent 10 hours or something driving, will be much more restricted to meetings that build relationships, and all the sort of technical sharing and that sort of conversation I can see happening on these virtual platforms, Teams, Zoom, etc. So yeah, I think business will definitely stay with what they've learned and the advantages, and I think it's going to be a fun place.
I certainly think so. I think this pandemic has, to a very large extent, accelerated us a little bit forward and forced us to use technology which otherwise would have seemed, unnecessary. So I think all over, it's a good thing. A question from the audience: how do you determine when to do legacy integration rather than replacement?
Okay. Maybe the first thing often with legacy systems, if you take, an area that we're often involved with is Profibus. So that's a field bus technology that's been around for many, many years. So while you've still got access to spares and everything, often a sort of a gateway that ties you into the newer industrial Ethernet technologies is still a very viable option because of the cost of not, in a sense, having to replace everything. And you've got the experience of people on your plants and that who understand, in a sense, those technologies. So I think there's a strong case for keeping legacy bits where almost, let's call it, the cost of taking it out doesn't justify the benefit of having a few additional sexy features which are maybe not that critical. You've managed so far with what you've had. I think if you have got, the intention of using a lot of modern technology, you've got a young staff, and you're in this sort of thing where the majority of what you're doing is in the sort of new brave world, and you've got this small little thing of some legacy system, there you might want to just get rid of it for the ability to simplify your life, even though maybe in that area it's not really cost justified, but it just makes ongoing management and training a whole lot easier. But I must say, at the moment, Although there are things to watch out for, the use of gateways and that to give you continuity between, in a sense, the old legacy world and the new world is quite powerful. So for those guys who run plants and that, investigate it in a bit more detail, why it is you want to throw out the bathwater and the baby, for something different. It's not always necessary.
Okay, good. I see we've only got 2 questions left. How does digital convergence affect employment and job creation? Would you say that, automation and digital convergence will replace human capital, or does it create jobs otherwise?
I think that question partly answered itself. There is no doubt that digital convergence is going to, in a sense, remove certain jobs. You're going to have robots and things or bots doing what people were doing. But I think there is the hope that with innovation, there are going to be new opportunities for people to do different things. And I think in the whole world, there's still, there's still that need for the human touch. Even though people might frustrate us in that, there's just something comforting that you can talk to a real person and not just some automated kind of voice.
Okay, I do have to agree with you there. I think we take comfort in speaking to a real person as opposed to all these automated messages that we get and automated auto responses, etc. So for sure, I think people take comfort in that. But I think the reality is that a lot of human jobs where human error occur will in future be taken over by convergence. The last question from the audience that I have here is, does South Africa have a suitable forum for exploring and developing Industry 4.0?
I don't think so in a formal sense, but we have, let's say in our industry, something like the SIIMC, which I think is tasked with that responsibility and also the drive to have like automation engineering in the universities. They've got working groups for education and technology. So I think we've got the sort of placeholders there, but I'm not sure how active we are yet in terms of a kind of formal forum that your big companies, the manufacturing giants like, AB InBev, all the mining houses and that are kind of subscribing into this growing pool of knowledge and sharing. I think we've got a long way to go.
Okay, good. Well, I think those were quite interactive session on the Q&A. Thank you so much for your knowledge, Dave. We really appreciate you presenting to our audience today. That brings us to a close. Thank you very much to all the attendees for attending our 7th AATF Technology Thursday. And thank you so much, Dave and the IDX team, for an informative and knowledge sharing session. We would like to also remind everyone about our next AATF Technology Thursday, which will be presented by RJ Connect on the 27th of August. And information around that can be seen on the screen at the moment. You can also follow us on social media and join our mailing list for more information. With that, I thank you all. Have a nice day.
Cheers.